So, the AI buzzword of the day, one of the hottest topics around, and I'm delighted today to be joined by some truly industry experts in the space. A little on me first, I'm the founder of the 20-Minute VC. For all those wondering what that is, it's the world's largest venture capital podcast, about 1.6 million downloads a month, and I'm also now a venture capitalist with Atomico in London. But I'd now like to welcome up my panelists for today. So we're going to start by welcoming Duncan Anderson. Now, Duncan is the European CTO at IBM Watson. He leads the European technical team for one of the world's foremost artificial intelligence and cognitive computing efforts. Welcome, Duncan. Mike Diadio, the CEO of World Quant, where he oversees various areas of the company's global activities, including technology and finance. Then we have Ben Medlock. Now, Ben is the co-founder of SwiftKey, where he invented the intelligent keyboard for smartphones and tablets. It's used on an astonishing 300 million devices. Makes my downloads look rather small. Thanks, Ben. And then we have Kate Niehaus. Now, Kate is a Rhodes Scholar. She's a Stanford undergrad. She also has a PhD in healthcare informatics and is currently a data scientist at Oxford University. And then finally, we have a colleague of mine in Siraj Khaliq. Now, Siraj was one of the very early employees at Google, where he oversaw the company growing from 60 to 6,000 people. He then co-founded Climate Corp, which he sold to Monsanto, and now he's a partner at Atomico. So, firstly, welcome all of you. Thank you so much. But obviously, AI, buzzword of the day. I want to start with a bit of contextual background. So let's start with some definitions. What is artificial intelligence and machine learning? As my mother says, AI, ML, you get so excited, but what on earth is it, Harry? So let's start with some definitions. So what is artificial intelligence and what is machine learning? Who would like to kick off today?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Ben, let's start with you.
So I guess AI is widely defined in many different ways. I think probably the easiest way to start is to say that in general, AI is interested in problems where human-style judgments are required. So typically, AI is differentiated from traditional programming problems where the solution has a very straightforward path and is relatively deterministically programmable using code. Whereas AI is about tasks where traditionally machines have been very poor because some kind of human-level judgment is required. There's a level of ambiguity in the task that requires a judgment that doesn't sit well within traditional programming techniques.
And then machine learning. What is the curious ML?
Well, I think AI is a bit of an umbrella term, whereas ML is perhaps a little bit more tightly defined as methods in which a model is trained using some data to make some prediction. That's at a very basic level. I think that's how I would define machine learning.
And I'm intrigued. We've got so many different verticals represented here. So do we have any other kind of varying definitions?
Well, let me try and, so that's a very technical view, and I asked myself, if I tried to tell that to my mom, she would have no idea what was just said, and it wouldn't have helped, right? Because I think to popular press, AI has had cycles. We're in another cycle now. It's hot. As you said, it's the buzzword. And I think to sort of the popular press, if I ask it's the Terminator, right? That's what they think about. It's that movie, The Terminator. It's taking over the world. It truly is become sentient. And unfortunately, that's what we get a lot. But then as things happen and we go through these cycles, we wind up getting Waze. We wind up getting, adaptive cruise control. We get all these things. And I read somewhere, I can't quote it, but I know someone said it other than me, but they said AI is just not what's been done yet. Mm-hmm. And machine learning is under that umbrella, but we see it as more where we are as self-directed, set a machine on a path to find something. That can be explained. But AI itself is a difficult concept to explain to I think, the more popularly.
Duncan, what's your take on this with IBM, probably one of the foremost leading institutions and companies?
Yeah, I think I would separate out AI as we see it today from the kind of Terminator futuristic view. I think we all have a tendency to jump to the end point on this stuff and what it might mean ultimately. But certainly in our lifetimes, we're not likely to see the Terminator. What we're likely to see is artificially intelligent machines which are good at doing very specific, narrow tasks. You mentioned the kind of automation in the car, right? So it's a very popular thing. We all have sat-navs on our car today. We all have cruise control. And probably in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll get automated driving capabilities for many of us, certainly on motorways. So we're likely to see that kind of incremental change for things that perhaps we don't think of as AI. It's just kind of part of our car. We just think of it as the next gizmo on the car. And I think it's that embedded nature that we're seeing in a lot of things today, not the kind of ultimate, movie science fiction kind of thing. And certainly that's where we focus in Watson, is the kind of quite practical implementation of this stuff.
And Kate, I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts on this, coming from the kind of academic background.
Yeah, and I think from the healthcare sort of perspective as well, I think that, as everyone's been saying, AI is kind of an umbrella term and machine learning fits within it. But if I was just kind of, popular press explain what machine learning is, it's basically any sort of time you have a predictive problem where you can predict something, or any time you're trying to reason under any sort of uncertainty, that can be framed as a machine learning problem. And so within healthcare, people often think like, oh gosh, are we having doctors being replaced by robots? Is that what artificial intelligence means in healthcare? And I think similarly to what we've been hearing, it's more kind of things that are happening without you even realizing. So in terms of diagnostics, making diagnostics that are trained on kind of a bunch of data and then used to help the doctor make a better decision. And similarly, even things like from a wellness perspective, like a Fitbit or something, there's tons of machine learning that's going into that sort of technology that you're just maybe not even aware of. So I would say that kind of from a healthcare perspective, there's lots of machine learning, lots of AI kind of already that exists, and it will continue to increase over time. Yeah.
Finally, Suraj, from the...
I think a lot of the most important stuff has already been said, but to someone speaking to a layperson, I would say, people immediately jump to this vision of the Terminator and, computers taking over the world. And, that's perhaps a logical conclusion, but to think that this is, a Terminator-style machine that thinks like we do, but much better, I think is a fallacy. These are AI, or the logical conclusion of it is something different. It's not necessarily sentience the way we think of sentience. So when we think about this in the short term, we should be thinking about shallow AI and a lot of what we said about not having to teach computers to do something, but let them infer how to do it from data. And longer term, this might be longer than people expect based on the buzz around this term right now, but longer term we start to think about ethical questions, the kind of problems that arise when you actually do have superintelligence.
You mentioned timescales there. I mean, some of this technology has been around for 60 years now. So I'm intrigued, what are the catalysts that's driving its rise now today? Why is it the buzzword today in 2016 when it hasn't been so much for the last 60 years? We have had cycles, we've had AI winters, but why now? What is the drivers? Let's start with Mike.
Well, I think there is a bit of buzz to it. I think that with the rise of the cloud, AWS, services where you can get access to a lot of compute power without the capital expenditure, that creates an opening. And then there is what we deal with all the time is just the amount of data that you can get access to has just grown dramatically. So you put these two things together and you get a better way to actually be able to do this, and the cost of entry is much lower, right? So now it's just about the algorithms or what have you. So popular press picks it up, it gets very interesting, it gets hot, everybody seems to want to do it. I think I'll say as well that we look at WorldQuant at ourselves and say, in a lot of ways, we've been doing this for the last 20 years, right? So a lot of folks who you talk about have already been doing this for a long time. It's just gotten hot in the press, I think, and that's probably because of the confluence of all these events that allow it to be more interesting now.
And you mentioned data availability. Obviously, IBM have huge data allowances and ownership. So talk to me about your perspective on that and the ability for that to drive AI forward today.
I think that one of the big differences is that the level of compute power has made a big advance. And some of the techniques and algorithms which we use today, people may have heard of a thing called a neural net. It was invented quite some decades ago and was almost sort of left as an interesting invention that wasn't going to lead anywhere. And it was only really the increase in compute power that made it economical to use some of those techniques at scale that's really behind some of the advancements we're seeing now. So that kind of combination of the kind of invention of the raw algorithms with the increasing commoditization and increasing power of the computes, and then the investment. So obviously, as soon as you get some kind of breakthrough, people like IBM and Google, et cetera, plow the investment in order to increase the research. And we're seeing that kind of reinforcement factor, I think, go around as the breakthroughs happen. People get more excited, so more money goes into the field, and we get more breakthroughs as a result. So that kind of acceleration is I think, why we get so much interest right now.
One massively interesting thing for me, actually, Ben, would be to hear your thoughts on kind of data availability, you as SwiftKey, when you were starting, and what you perceive as kind of the incumbency advantage, and whether there really is one today in the AI space, with incumbents like Google having so much data.
Yeah, people sort of talking about data oligarchies, and I think that's a real risk. I think if you think about how we do machine learning and AI today, it is essentially exactly as these guys have said. It's about gathering a huge volume of data and essentially building systems that do pattern recognition across millions or even billions of data samples. And one of the interesting things is that that's really not the way the human brain works. I mean, the way we learn is actually by bootstrapping from a very few examples. And there's this thing in machine learning which we call transfer learning, which is where you learn to do something. Let's say you learn how to translate from one language into another, and that then helps you to do other things like categorize news stories. And I think that the fact that current systems rely so heavily on data, it means that there's this real risk that the Googles, the Facebooks, the IBMs do become sort of untouchable. But I suppose the interesting question is that the way these techniques will go in the long term, or will we move towards something that actually doesn't rely so much on these vast data sets, but relies more on agents that are able to bootstrap very quickly from a small number of samples? That's kind of what I'm interested in.
Do you think from a startup perspective today, there is the potential for startups to gain access to these training data sets? Is there platforms and resources that will allow them to?
Well, what the big companies have done is to open source a sort of subset of the data and the techniques that they use. And that certainly really helps. I think it does push research forwards. I guess, if I'm sitting in the Google headquarters, I'm thinking about how do I make enough of this stuff open source that everybody's not up in arms, but at the same time, making sure that I have enough of an advantage to stay ahead. And I think that's what you see. So, the good thing is that the whole industry is moving forwards very rapidly. That's great. But I think to really compete in some of the most difficult problems, particularly without just being acquired, is extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm. Kate, I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts on this now, in particular, and at Oxford, the kind of availability for you.
Yeah. So I think the data availability question is definitely a very important one from the healthcare perspective, and I think that it's slightly different because within healthcare, a lot of data is private and it's kind of patient sensitive, and so you don't have this sort of abundance. And for instance, kind of talking about these huge advances we've had over the last few years, specifically in sort of subjects like imaging, sort of image recognition has really improved through this sort of deep learning neural net techniques, and also the data availability is a huge part of it. And so I think for something like within healthcare where it's a lot harder, you've seen kind of slower progression in terms of these huge improvements over the immediate recent time span. And I think that's partially, there's this open source availability of the data, so there's big competitions every year, people compete, and so the algorithms they're advancing so quickly now, it's like you can't even catch up if you stay out of literature for a week, it's already moved ahead. And so I think data availability is a huge kind of difficulty. You need to make sure that you are maintaining sort of data privacy, but also I think that there is a lot of advantage and kind of gain from the whole community if people are willing to share their data in these ways to kind of advance sort of diagnostics and understanding of disease and these sorts of things.
And with the gains to be made, Duncan, you mentioned the investment going into the space. Suraj, I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts on kind of witnessing that firsthand with Atomico.
Yeah. Well, the investment gains to be made are there because of the sheer volume of innovation going on. But to your earlier question of why now, what's enabling this? So we've talked about the availability of data. Just my company, prior to joining Atomico, we used machine learning to improve the way crops are grown. So we trained a model on all this agronomic data. So and we did this by various crops, so crop varietal, soil type, weather, And based on that, we were able to predict yield and then start to tell farmers, actually, you should be doing this. You should be applying more fertilizer here or less here, or irrigating here or there. And farmers are very, very good at this. They've been doing it for millennia. But we could teach farmers a thing or two and increase their yields by a couple of %. And that was just the beginning. So that was an example where we went in with an idea. We weren't from ag backgrounds. We thought, okay, we know how to deal with large data sets. Can we do something interesting here? And we did, right? And the investors that invested in us at that point were rewarded for it because it was a big outcome. It was north of $1 billion, a couple of years ago. But so that's a very concrete example of investment returns. And as it turns out, Atomico was one of the investors in me, so that's how I know Atomico. So that's here today. But sensors have never been cheaper. Communications infrastructure is super cheap. We could imagine sensors, 1,000 sensors in this room, 10,000 sensors in a typical field that are returning information at a resolution that we can really start to do things with and build models on. So that's super exciting. But secondly, and we touched on this a little bit, so these models have been around for a long, long time. We've talked about AI for a long time. Alan Turing was thinking about AI in the 50s. But what has really changed? There's the data, and then there's Moore's Law. As it turns out, we're doing better than Moore's Law because that's about CPUs, and now we're using GPUs and ASICs. But beyond that, and this is where Europe is really interesting, a lot of academic work from people who are originally from Europe, like Jeff Hinton or Jan LeCun, have set the foundation in the last 10 years for this new wave of AI. So I disagree that it's buzz. I think something has changed and changed very deeply, and not to overuse the word deep, but in a way that it's a very exciting time for us to be not just in investing, but really to exist on this planet.
And Duncan, sorry.
Can I just interject a bit on what Ben said earlier? I think it's really important because we talk about big data. We work in that. We have hundreds of data sets and millions of trading signals. But there's also a sense of small data, which is what Ben said, which is think about what happened in the recent elections here in the US. I hate to put politics into this, but polling is about small sets of data. And if garbage goes in, then no matter how good your models are, no matter how good your AI is, garbage comes out. And I think that's something else. That noise ratio, especially when the data set is small, really matters. And if you ignore that and you think these algorithms, when you put it on this much data, work on this much, you get really bad predictive outcomes. And that's something that I think everyone has to be very careful of. We're very careful of it in our business because if we don't have enough data, we don't really trust the output, right? But when you get polling, which just doesn't work anymore because there's a bias in the actual way you gather the data. If you're not aware of the biases in how you gather the data, it doesn't matter how good your AI is. It doesn't even matter if you have a real brain. It just has a bad output.
Can I ask then, how do you insert a sense of quality assurance to the data outcomes that you get? As you said, there is some biases and some potentially interesting predictions.
Well, in our world, we have a whole bunch of metrics we have to run over the data before we consider it valid to be used. Point in time is critical. For example, if you have a data set and in the history something was wrong or an analyst changes their mind a week later and revises data, that doesn't work for trading algorithms, right? Because it has to be the data as it was at that time. Because if it's corrected later, it'll look a lot better in backtesting, right? So those kind of things, point in time, enough granularity, not as much, not too many blanks or what have you. So that helps us a lot. But that's a bit more, it's more rule-based. When you get into polling, for example, I don't know the answer to this. I've just been a student of it, to be fair, lately. If somebody tells you one thing on the phone because they're embarrassed to tell you something else, but they'll tell you something else on a poll that's on their iPhone, now you've got a real bias, and that's hard. And I have no idea how to answer that for people with a lot more intelligence than I, but I know it's there.
I'm intrigued. Does anyone? I'm slightly dumbfounded by that too. So would anyone have any suggestions as to the interesting outcomes that can occur from these data inputs that are potentially unreliable?
Yeah, there's some actual interesting outcomes from this kind of overfitting as well that could have broader implications. So, as we teach essentially what our black box is, to do things that normally we would have coded rules to do, we have much less visibility into it. Obviously, it's harder to debug when things go wrong, but also some of the things that would never be socially acceptable to us may be incorporated into this black box. A case in point was IBM's, Tay AI, which, very quickly they launched it and it learned from discussions on the internet.
Microsoft, not us.
Microsoft, sorry. And then it learned to become racist and sexist all within the course of a few hours, and they had to shut it down, right? And that's one example of overfitting, and really terribly so. But what happens when black boxes are making decisions on granting someone a loan or not for their house, right? This is someone's life that is affected by it, or parole applications, or how you teach someone in an adaptive way. Maybe it's making decisions that we're trusting it with, and it's actually making some occasionally really bad decisions. It's a real problem, and it's one that there's no real single answer to. But we need to start thinking in terms of higher level constructs, as Ben was saying. Beyond just throwing a bunch of data and training a black box. What are the constructs above that, the layers of abstraction we can start to look at and maybe set up rules that will help avoid biases or racism or sexism or some of the issues that would come from just blindly trained systems.
Ben?
Yeah, I think actually the polling problem is in some ways quite simple to define. The problem is that you always want to look at what people do, not what they say. And polling is based on what people say. So if we want more accurate polling, what we need to do is come up with systems that are better at observing people's behavior. That's a much better predictor, it turns out, in many cases, of what they're actually going to do. And that kind of makes sense. So I think the whole polling industry needs to look again at how it gathers its data and getting more sophisticated than just, I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton.
Do you see hope in the future for kind of further accuracy in that data collection phase?
I think so, yeah. I mean, the interesting thing is that the nice thing about polling is it's very straightforward. Everybody can understand. You take a sample of people, you ask them who they're going to vote for, and that gives you a prediction. If you really want to do better and you want to look at the way people behave, then you're going to have to use more sophisticated techniques. And the problem with that then is that it's much more difficult to say why a certain prediction was made. So you observe, someone's buying behavior or their online behavior, whatever it is, and that leads to a prediction about how they're going to vote. The problem is, as in the case with all the other sort of black box machine learning techniques, it's very difficult to pull a succinct series of motivations for why the machine predicted in a certain way. But that's the nice thing about that is that's a problem across the whole of machine learning. So we should be trying to solve that problem. We should be building neural networks that are able to say, here's some understandable reason why I made that prediction.
Do we not have that already in contextual learning? I had a founder yesterday pitch me with contextual learning in his to-do list app, which actually seemed rather...
Well, I think there's some progress, but the problem with all these things is actually the real economic value is not in being able to explain what you do, it's in being able to do it better. So there isn't a huge focus on that, but I think that there should be much more.
Yeah, and I think there is certainly a lot of research in the area because it is, well, in some cases it's not necessarily an economic focus. It's if you try and give a doctor some sort of black box, they're just not going to believe it unless they understand why it's giving these predictions, which is very important because it's very easy to get biased data without even realizing it. Like all the polls, they didn't really realize, and that happens across the board. In medicine, it's like people are getting treatment all the time, and maybe you don't see some sort of outcome for a certain type of patients. Like there's some, it looked like some big study, they saw that in the ICU, people who came in for, I think it was for pneumonia, if they had asthma, it was like a great protector for dying in the ICU. And it was like, that wasn't it at all. It's just people with asthma were treated more intensely. And so if you use that into your algorithm, it's just going to give you terrible results. And it's not something that you necessarily think about ahead of time because it's very subtle. And so it really is important to make sort of more interpretable models. And people are working on it, but it's tricky. The models are complex. So I think to take this out is difficult.
This is an interesting point because you say there's also the human uptake of what comes out of these boxes, right? We work in a firm that is about black box trading. That's what we do. But about it changes all the time because we have so many new signals coming in, but of our couple million, 75% are machine generated, 25% are actually human generated, right? And those ratios change every day, so you can't quote me on it. But it's interesting, some of our portfolio construction people who put them together, they don't trust the machine signals as much. They weight them less. They just generally don't like them as much. Why? Who knows, right? But anecdotally, I was in a car with one of them the other day, and his Waze popped up and said, "Oh, here's a new way. It's 5 minutes faster." And he's never seen that way. I'd never seen that way before, but he just blindly went and did it. I'm like, why would you listen to that and trust it and not listen to all this that we spend all this money on and not trust it as much? So there's a trust factor in actually starting to get comfortable with what's generated from any of this.
But I think the kind of really understanding the data is at the heart of it. And as an example I had recently, we're doing some work in the medical field around oncology, and I was talking to an oncologist who specializes in a particular type of brain cancer. And he was explaining that this particular type of brain cancer that everyone had thought was one disease, turns out it's actually 20 different types of disease. And depends on the genetics as to which version you've got, as to what the modern treatment plan would be. But when they collected the historical data, they hadn't got the genetics. So all of the historical data is suddenly invalidated once they discover that the genetics tells you which subtype of disease it is. So it's so much complexity in really understanding the input data and the projections that you can make from it. And you can suddenly hit a brick wall in this example where everyone thought we were doing fantastically well, we were making advances, and suddenly all your historic data you need to throw away and start again because you don't have the genetics to back it up. So it's a very unpredictable science, this field.
And we spoke about the trust there, Mike, in particular from you. And as an interviewer, everyone that I speak to always wants to talk about how it affects us as humans. So going to the Terminator reference that we all have heard, I'm sure, many times, what does this mean for the future of humanity when taxi drivers trust Waze more than they do 40 years as a black cab driver? What does this mean for mum and pop shops? What does it mean for humans in the future of work? It's a tasty question to answer, so
I can start, sure. I mean, people look at some of the revolutions that have happened recently, cloud computing, mobile, or just the internet, and those are very, very important revolutions, but they're still kind of steps forward, but they've not redefined the way we work in society. And this is why AI is really interesting right now, is because it's more akin to mechanization in the 1800s than anything that's happened since then. That disrupted physical workers. This disrupts knowledge workers, and that poses all kinds of problems and questions to society that we're going to have to start to figure out, and not just us as technologists, but society as a whole. The positive or the optimistic view of this is that we're going to be able to do things that we were never able to do before, not just doing something that a human is doing but better, but doing something that is just completely different. And I'll give you one example which might actually be really interesting because it made me really take note. So many of you have probably seen AlphaGo's win against Lee Sedol earlier this year. Now, when I was in university 20 years ago, my professor told me, what had just happened was Deep Blue, an IBM special purpose chess computer, had just beat Garry Kasparov. Right? This was you guys for sure, But it was really something where everybody got really excited about AI again, which had been the sleepy field. And even though in the modern sense it's perhaps not, it's kind of a brute force approach. If you extrapolated Moore's law, a lot of the people at the time said, well, this approach is great for chess, but it's never going to work for Go, because it'll take us 100 years, even taking into account all the computing power increases. Just you can't brute force it. And here we are, 20 years later, and this happened. Now, there are a number of reasons. We don't need to go into why it's happened. We talked about some of that earlier. But one thing I wanted to draw attention to is there's this particular game. So there's a 5-game series. And in game 2, Move 37, AlphaGo, which is the computer, made this move that everybody at the time thought, oh, this is a blunder, this is a stupid move, and people were surprised at it, right? And the genius of that move only became apparent later on when it went on to win this game, and it had everybody in the Go community thinking, what was that, right? And humans have been playing this game for 3,000 years, and here's a computer that taught us something new, which makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck, when you think about the implications of that. This is an AI teaching humanity something it had not contemplated before. And now, it's reinvigorated people's interest in the game. All these Go experts are now scratching their heads and, upping their game as a result. But it's a symbol of what we can do as humanity, whether that's in healthcare and diagnoses, whether it's in the way we teach people. Ag, I think, partly because of my background, I think it's very interesting and be an important part of how we feed humanity. Very, very interesting directions coming from this. So, yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up to that then? And is it an empowerment tool then that makes us kind of these superhumans? Or is it, I think we said earlier about the film, is it WALL-E? where kind of humans are looked after by robots and we're almost disabled.
Yeah, well, that's a big societal question is, what if we are disrupted, knowledge workers, then what do people do, right? And there's charitable interpretations saying, oh, we have free time, we can go to the beach and compose poetry and music, and machines will take care of us. But do we want to live in a society where 95% of us are on a universal basic income and composing art, whereas maybe 2% are creaming the profits at the top, as a global elite, and then there's some discontents in the middle. Even if that were a stable system, which it probably isn't, that's probably not where we want to be. So we need to think about where we end up. It's not going to be an easy transition, and I don't think we have close to the answers, but it's something that until we start talking about overtly, we can't address it. Some of the effects of it we've seen today. People are now blaming immigrants, but the reality is their jobs were taken by machines, and that's going to accelerate as time goes on.
Okay, so what's your take on the future of work? Obviously, there's a lot of disruption to happen in medicine in particular.
Yeah. So, and I think I would also say, the machines will be making the poetry and art as well. That's also possible. I think in medicine, so I think kind of what we've been seeing is a lot of this automation is replacing kind of lower skilled workers. And I think in medicine, a lot of what machines can offer is, as we were saying, kind of replacing the doctor, which is a very highly skilled job. And I think it's kind of useful to think of this in terms of the sort of superhuman sense of, well, there's a lot of things that doctors can do, and there's a lot of things that they can't do. Like a doctor can't look at your genome and tell you what that means, and machines are very good at that, and the machines are better and should be doing that. And so I think kind of in the short term, there's going to be a lot of tools kind of helping to support doctors and support other healthcare workers in doing their job. And I think longer term, so I was talking to my sister who is in medical school actually, and telling her that, eventually I think machines will replace doctors. And she was like, well, there's no way. You can't see a patient. It's like, well, you can in imaging, you can see a patient. She's like, oh, well, a doctor can hear from their stethoscope. And it's like, well, there's sensors that can do that. Well, you can touch them, sensors. So this is all kind of, not right now, but I think eventually we will get to the point where we do have the sort of sensory capacity from machines and from the data side as well, where we can kind of replace a lot of these very highly skilled jobs where doctors spend years training for this. And it is a question of where we want to go with that. And I think there's still many ways that, just thinking narrowly within the sort of medical realm, there's a lot of things a doctor can do that machines still, at least right now, aren't very good at, kind of, providing empathy for a patient, kind of being this more supportive role, which is part of a role for a doctor, but not the only one right now. And so maybe we'll see jobs shifting in that direction. I think it's going to be interesting to see. I don't know where the sort of economic system will go, because, what happens when you only have a few people whose skills are needed to make this sort of meta machine.
Can I ask a very challenging question here? And, if my taxi driver listens to Waze and it goes the wrong way, I'll be pretty annoyed, but I think I'll get over it. But if I get misdiagnosed, I think I'd be a little more than annoyed. So how do we address this?
Yeah, I think it's a really big problem and a really big challenge because, and this is something you also see kind of in the self-driving car world where, you're comparing the machine against sort of this ultimate truth. And And we're saying that humans aren't the ultimate truth. Humans make mistakes. Humans make mistakes. Doctors make mistakes with diagnoses. They make mistakes with treatment. And that's one of the kind of, ways that you can propose these sort of AI techniques as improving that. But I think it's important to remember that people do make mistakes, and so in making these comparisons, it's sort of false comparison, but it's still a very important question, because and we were talking about this earlier, kind of the question of what does the car do if it's faced with kind of this ethical challenge of killing one person or killing two people or like a child, and so it's things that I think really need to be thought about, and part of the reason why it hasn't been necessarily so readily adopted within medicine, because these are difficult, challenging questions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Ben, what's your take, kind of coming from the now very big institution of Microsoft and looking forward to the future of work that you're potentially building at Microsoft? What's your take?
So I guess in terms of this question around what's going to happen when people lose their jobs, and for me, the most interesting thing to think about is the speed with which technology can reshape modern environments, colliding with the sort of glacial slowness of the evolution of the human brain and human motivations and intentions. So it's kind of interesting to think that we are adapted for the environment as it was about 50,000 years ago. And if you compare the human beings on the savannah to modern city environments, the change is mind-blowing. And yet we're still driven by essentially the same things. I sort of imagine this sort of future of I guess a kind of nightmare, dystopian scenario where AI and virtual reality come together, and most of us spend most of our time with VR helmets on, playing first-person shoot-'em-up games and watching porn. And
In what order?
I'm going somewhere with this. I think the point is that these activities are actually what drove the adoption of the internet globally, and they are hunting and mating. They're the two things that have driven humanity for the last 50, 100,000 years. So I think the interesting question is, our brains are adapted for doing stuff that brings us the ability to survive, to sustain ourselves, and to procreate. And that's still what we care about, and that's not going to change. Whether we have driverless cars or augmented reality or superintelligence, that just evolves very, very slowly. So you have a society where you don't need to work to do these things. We're still going to be motivated to do the same things. Our reward functions are going to we're going to have to find new ways of fulfilling our reward functions. And I think we've always done that as humans. So I actually I'm not worried that we won't be able to manage, a scenario where everybody has a basic income. But I do think it's no one knows how this is going to play out, but it's the most fascinating question for me. The collision of these two things.
Are you worried, though, in today's highly advanced technological world, that the adoption cycles are so much shorter than potentially in Industrial Revolution times, that we don't have the time to transition as a human race?
I think that the other side of this argument is that the human brain is the most remarkable organ. I mean, it's absolutely incredible how quickly the human brain does adapt. The very fact that we're all living in these cities, whereas the vast majority of our physiology and neurology is actually adapted for the savannah. That is testament to the remarkable power of the human brain, the plasticity of the human brain to adapt to different challenges. So I think we will adapt, actually, and we will adapt pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Mike, what's your take?
So
VR porn?
Yeah.
Future work?
Well, I think Ben said a lot about this pace of change. Without the porn comment, I didn't have that one coming. But I think actually, I'll take a little bit of a different view. I am very worried that we can't react fast enough. I actually agree that the plasticity of the human brain is pretty remarkable. I worry about the plasticity of a mass of human brains, which is, in my view, far less. And the pace of change has gone up so fast that I think we have a real challenge if we look at where, again, the political, especially Western world, political winds are blowing. It's the opposite direction. And there could be a very big day of reckoning. I mean, if you look back at the Industrial Revolution and are a student of history, you know, a lot of these big changes, which happened over much more glacial timeframes, caused world wars. And, you know, you could take a very skeptic's view of it and say, in some ways, the world wars cleansed out a whole bunch of people who no longer had a way to earn a living and sort of give you a reset for civilization and society. You could say that about the plague way back many years ago. So I actually am very worried because while this pace of change is going faster, the socioeconomic setup of democracies especially, listen, democracies aren't the best form of, they're not the perfect form of government, they're just the best form we've got. So they don't move fast. And when you have gridlock and what have you, it's a challenge.
So if we take kind of plasticity of human brains and our abilities and then kind of correlate that to governments and government policies and regulations, do we have the plasticity of government regulations to kind of harness this ecosystem?
If you want to say the plasticity of how fast regulations take to put in, then you're just, the word doesn't even apply anymore. I think you are screwed. But I will say, I'll give an anecdote, because I think we're weighted on the older end of the panel over here, so I'll date myself a little bit, speaking for myself at least. But I have my oldest daughter's 12, and you know, I watch the way she communicates and the way she does things now, and it baffles even me at times. You know, you turn 12. What's that?
Snapchat.
Snapchat. She just got this new CAD game where it's this Planet Coaster thing, and it's a true CAD. I mean, you're computer-aided design, you're building things. And I looked at her, and she had it on. I finally got it working on her Mac, and I looked at her, and like 15 minutes later, she's doing all these things, and I'm like, well, you just started playing this. Did you read the instruction manual? She looks at me, she says, Dad, I watched YouTube. She watched YouTube for 2 weeks before she got the game, and she's already doing it. And this is some sophisticated stuff. I'm even looking at it going, I have no idea what you're doing. And then she turned 12, and I said, listen, you can have your Facebook password now. She needed it for games long ago, but I never let her use it. And she looked at me, she said, old people use Facebook. We don't use it. And by the way, while you're at it, stop sending me emails, because that's only for school. We don't use emails. Snapchat, everything else. So I think that there is a generational situation here where my dad is in his 60s and a retired police officer, and thank God he's got a pension, because everyone says, oh, more people, more value-added things you can do as all these things take over and do the mundane stuff. But not everybody can do more value-added things because they weren't trained to do that way when they were younger. Maybe as we get forward, our children, they're so used to this, and instant on, and YouTube and user manuals are gone, that there will be a big shift because of the plasticity of the human brain. I'm quite worried for the next 30 years before we get there. That worries me a lot.
And then before we go into a Q&A, I'd love to hear, Duncan, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of danger that we, as novices, we assume that we're here and there's this kind of straight line to Terminator, and it's just a case of how long is this line, right? That's the only question. But I don't think it's like that at all. I think it's we make advancements and then we get stuck. And might get stuck for many, many years, and then we make some more advancements. And it's a very unpredictable route towards Terminator. And right now, we're on a phase of that graph where we're making big advancements, and it feels like there's inevitability, but that's not necessarily the case. And in particular, my personal belief is that we will get stuck on certain things. And I use the example of the self-driving car as a good explainer for this, that in the next 5 to 10 years, I would guess a lot of us in the room will have cars that will self-drive on the motorway, right? That's happening. It's inevitable. But whether we will get to the stage where we will have a self-driving car that can navigate the local roads around where I live, where there's a large school and lots of mums dropping their kids off, lots of congestion, total chaos, to be honest, at drop-off time, whether a self-driving car will be good enough to navigate that complexity. There was an interesting article I read the other day about will humans bully self-driving cars? Because the self-driving car will have a lot of safety features built into it. It won't take the risks that we as humans will take. Right? So does that mean that I'm going to just head on straight at the self-driving car, knowing that it will chicken out, basically? It feels inevitable. It feels inevitable that we will have self-driving cars that won't work in certain situations, and that we will take manual control in order to take the risks that we as humans like taking to get there faster. Right? So I think that's inevitable. But what I think we can see quite clearly is that there's going to be a class of jobs which is inevitably affected. And people whose jobs are in working in call centres or long-distance truck drivers on motorways, these jobs are at risk. In fact, I brought this. This will be the one and only time that I quote the Daily Mail. But today's Daily Mail, Mark Carney made a speech yesterday. Bank chief robots to steal 15 million of your jobs, right? So doom-laden Carney warns middle classes will be hollowed out by new technology. But I think there's a serious, whether it's 15 million, that seems a bit over the top to me, but there's a serious threat that certain classes of jobs will disappear. My personal belief is that we will see AI in our lifetimes more assistive for most jobs. So as a doctor, AI will help me make better decisions. I don't think we're likely to see it completely replacing the doctor. But for certain lower skilled jobs, there is a risk. And I think that is a big question for society. How do we cope with that? Because we mentioned already the kind of political situation today. When people feel disaffected, they feel that society is not working for them, that the options that they once had are disappearing. That is going to create political turmoil. And in some senses, we're seeing that already. And it may be misdirected onto issues that are more visible than the robots taking their jobs. But there's a lot of questions for society here.
And I just wanted to interject. I think there is a big distinction to be made for doctors being sort of disintermediated a bit, because they are a high-skill, trained set of people who can go do other things, and they do.
Yeah.
Then the lower side of it, like the truck drivers, where if you've been driving a truck for 20 years, saving up for your kid's college, and then now one driver can do 3 trucks down the motorway, there's retraining there is a completely different ballgame. So there needs to be a distinction that the impact of the speed up is very different at the different ends of the barbell.
And with these big questions for society, I'd love to open it up now to your questions. So I think we're going to do a Q&A now. I think we've got about 11 minutes and 40 seconds, just to be precise. So I'd love to hear your questions. So let's start over here. Do we have a mic that we can...
Ryan Robbins with the Military Leadership Circle. So you brought up VR and some of the gaming that goes along. I'm interested in where you see AI going with video games and the effect that does have on kids as it pulls them in. I've got a 12-year-old son, and Minecraft actually had a very devastating effect on him to the point of almost a heroin addiction. So do you see AI causing problems in the future of gaming to where it actually starts to stunt the growth of our up-and-coming generation? Or is anybody really looking at that?
Can I just say something about the Minecraft thing is interesting, and I think anything can be addictive. But there was a great article, I think it was in the New York Times recently, on Minecraft essentially being visual programming. I mean, there's anything too much is bad, even oxygen, right? So I see my kids playing jointly Minecraft, and again, it's another thing that doesn't have an instruction manual. They learn from each other, they watch YouTube, they share thoughts, they build things. They know if they get the gold axe, then they get the diamond axe, and the dog, your wolf becomes a dog if you feed it food. And it's very, very positive. And now they have gates in there. You can actually make a little transistor. I think Minecraft is one of the better games out there because it allows you to build things and learn in a very process-oriented way. But then again, I can't comment on the fact that anything can be taken to extreme. And if you live in there too long, then something's got to go wrong. But there are better than worse games, I think.
And, I wouldn't necessarily, say this is an issue with AI. Computer games have been around since I was a child, and I grew up playing them. as parents, I think there are a lot of questions around what is the best way to structure that, but done well. There's my nieces and nephews that are older than my 18-month-old are doing extraordinary things and telling me things that I'm really surprised at, and they learned it from an iPad application, right? So we need to harness these in the right way. But you raise a really important question of how do we know what is too much, and what are the things as parents we need to do to intervene or stop things getting too far from the real world?
I think there are some interesting implications, though. We've been playing with robotics, and we have this little robot. It's from a company called Orderbrand. It's about this
We have those
tool.
too. Yeah.
Little plastic thing. It's very cute.
They dance too.
And they dance, dance the Macarena. And I took it home, and my wife had some friends around, and I just got back from the US, and what is this thing you've got? So I got it out and turned it on, and it did its show, and it danced and all the rest of it. And the thing that struck me was that nobody referred to it as it. Everybody called it he. Because this thing had a name, it was called Newton. And everyone called it he, and everyone was talking to it as if, little chap, how are you? And these are, in terms of the kind of, if this is zero AI and this is Terminator, this thing is down here somewhere. Yeah. It's not that clever.
Yeah, it's just not.
It's just not that clever. But because it looked a little human and it had some fake AI, people completely transformed the way they interacted with it.
Yeah.
And it just makes me think, when we get nearer this end, if we're like this at this end, what on earth are we going to be like when we're at this end?
But I think that it says more about us than it does about the AI.
Absolutely.
We anthropomorphize.
All computers.
Kids will anthropomorphize, a little stick and stroke it.
Yeah.
So I think it says mostly, our brains are wired to predict. They're wired to predict animacy and agency, actually, because that is the best way to protect ourselves. So we're always overproductive. We always see things in clouds and tapestries, and
But if you imagine the games, when you get games that become more immersive and have AI, and it feels like you're talking to a real person when you're interacting in the game, I think there's a legitimate risk there.
That's the risk, because you can't differentiate it.
Yeah, people will get sucked into these things. I think it's something that we will need to think about.
I think we'll move to another question now. So I don't know if we have a mic to go over there.
My question is on talent. You have a big tech company here, startups and hedge fund, and someone from university. And all of you have vested interest to attract and retain and motivate best talent. And all of you poach from each other. So what is the strategy you apply to retain and motivate and hire the best talent?
Give them lots of computer games and VR.
That sounds very dog-eat-dog, but no, I mean, the way we think about it at Atomico is we think about, we're investing in companies in Europe, and anything that gets people interested in technology and brings more people into it is a good thing. So it's positive. So it's not, how can we get people out of big corporations and how can they overpay potentially for people who are at startups? That's rarely what happens. I mean, I think the bigger problem is, is Brexit going to stop people wanting to come to the UK specifically for UK companies? So it's not necessarily a town war. There's 4.7 million developers in Europe. That's more than the 4.1 million in the US. So, for us specifically, we're not overly concerned about it.
And we have a bit of a different view, and I'll quote our founder Igor here, that talent's distributed pretty statistically around the world, opportunities not. So we go, and if there's 4.1 in Europe and 4.7 or whatever, we go where the talent is. So we're all over Asia, we're in Eastern Europe, and that gives us a tremendous competitive advantage because a lot of folks aren't there to compete. We don't worry about visas. We just take the opportunity to the actual location that we find these skills. So we have 22 offices, 15 countries, and that really gives us access to the very best skills. And then you bring that kind of opportunity to a local market where there's no competition for what you do. And that keeps people very engaged and very motivated and very interested.
I think there is the big advantage that you can't put an ad out there and say, I need somebody with 20 years experience of doing this stuff, right? Because those people don't exist generally. So it's more about the raw talent, the brain power. I always say I'd much rather have somebody who's really young with raw brain power than somebody with lots of experience. And it's about how do you attract those young people with the raw talent, and then kind of mold that talent in a way that makes sense for your business. So, the things that you do to attract, it's all around creating the environment that young people like.
I think I can lend to that pretty well, actually. I'm only 20, despite the wrinkles. But I recently was interviewed by Siraj and some of the other partners at Atomico, and very kindly, I had some other offers on the table, but I was absolutely drawn to Atomico because of the people. Like any investment, it starts with a team. And it wasn't a group of investors, which everyone else seemed to be, which isn't a problem. But I saw a team of founders who were hungry to prove that they could show the world of Europe's technical talent and bring that to the forefront. And so for me, it was their vision and their drive that made it such an enticing proposition that I simply couldn't not join. So I think that, for me, in particular, as a young person, relatively young person,
make a dent in the universe.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree, and also just creating an environment where people feel like they can learn a lot. I think a lot of people who are drawn to these sorts of problems really like to continue learning, and so kind of allowing a sort of freedom and the ability to continue doing that, I think, is a big part, as well as attracting people.
Ben, what's your take from SwiftKey days?
Smoothies and ping pong tables.
I mean, I would have joined you too, yeah.
Our Bangkok general manager said the best investment we ever made there was the ping pong table.
And then I think we've probably got time for one more question. Let's go here. Do we have a mic?
Just really quick, but how many years until we see a generalized artificial intelligence that can do more than the one specialized thing? And not, I don't just mean the DeepMind overhyped stuff about playing 2 games. And even if that you think that's a very long way in the future, what's the breakthrough that we need to make to get there?
Easy question, guys. Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I can start with that. Probably not a bad question to end on, actually. So AGI, artificial general intelligence, generally is defined as the point at which AI reaches kind of human level ability to perform a wide range of tasks in different environments. So I would differentiate that from something that can genuinely do more than one task, because that will happen much more quickly. But sort of AGI, I think it's at least a century away, personally, and maybe even more than that. And the thing that I think is underrepresented in this argument is the problem of embodiment. So we think about human beings and the evolution of our own intelligence, which has taken a couple of 100,000 years, but actually the cells upon which we're based have been around for a very much longer time than that. And I think AI is going to need to be embedded in its environment, and I think this is going to take much longer than we think. No one knows what kind of breakthroughs are needed, but certainly the kind of technologies that we have today that do this kind of mass-scale pattern recognition are really nothing like the human brain. So there's a long way to go.
And then we have 1 minute left, so who wants to count us down?
Sure. I mean, I won't venture to put a timeline on it, but there are a few steps that need to be taken to get there. AGI, I don't want to belittle what DeepMind is doing, because they are actually the most interesting place right now on the planet doing AI research. And speaking internally with them, it's clear they've already had breakthroughs in areas beyond this, and they're doing a lot of work in medicine as well. So, when you talk about general intelligence, there's something that generally can do things that you don't have to train it individually for each task to do. But then there's perhaps in your question also sentience and the Terminator point. That may be very, very far out, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't start thinking about the challenges around it today. Off switches or ethics or some of the things that will become important, because when we get there, it may be too late if we're not already being proactive.
And I think on that is the end of the panel. Thank you so much